We expect historians, and last week Michael Mahoney helped us think about how our views of, as well as our understanding and use of science and technology have changed over the centuries. We will also hear from a philosopher and an engineer in the course of our journey. Tonight it is philosophy's turn. After receiving his PhD from Harvard, Professor Daniel Garber spent several years at the University of Chicago before joining Princeton's philosophy department, of which he is the chair, in 2002. He's also an associate member of the program in the history of science. With a particular interest in the 17th century, he's written 2 books about Descartes, and is co-editor of both the Cambridge History of 17th Century Philosophy and the annual Oxford Studies in Early Modern Philosophy. But it is his principal interest in the relations between philosophy, science, and society during the scientific revolution that put him on everyone's list to be part of this series. Some people's hope they can turn that off. Even without those academic credentials, however, the title alone of this lecture makes us eager to hear from him. Science, God, and Intelligent Design in the Scientific Revolution. Professor Garber.
Thank you very, very much, Nancy, and I'm delighted to be here. And a little bit surprised at how many people are interested in what is sort of an arcane topic. But I hope that we'll get an interesting discussion going afterwards. It's a very interesting material. There's been, of course, a recent flap over intelligent design, creationism, that went so far as court cases about the teaching of creation science first, and more recently intelligent design later in the schools. We'll get back to the 17th century in a moment. But I want to begin by talking about more recent things. Both, of course, are anti-Darwinian accounts of the origins of life. Creation science, explicitly theological, says that God created life through a special act of creation, as it says in Genesis. Intelligent design is not explicitly theological, but implicitly theological, that some intelligent designer created life through an act of special creation, and although the intelligent design people don't identify exactly who that creator is, the intelligent designer is generally understood to be traditional God of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, I don't want to get into detailed issues here, of which there are many and varied, and I think it's not just a scientific or philosophical issue. Among the issues I think that are involved in this dispute include the current scientific status of evolutionary theory and its possible weaknesses, the question of open-mindedness in scientific education, whether one is obligated to teach alternative points of view, question of separation of church and state, the question, finally, of who it is that determines what's taught in the schools, and the rights of parents to determine what it is that their children are taught in the schools. But what concerns me is something else that I think comes up in the context of this affair, both from the first incarnation with creation science and the more recent incarnation with intelligent design, and that is the definition of what it is to be science and what it is to be scientific. One of the arguments against intelligent design, and even more so against creation science, is that it isn't really science, but it's religion. And that's the question that really interests me tonight. Is it science? Can science bring in God, either explicitly or implicitly? And is it still science if it does so? Now, the intelligent design and creation science people, of course, think that it can be. But the general consensus of the philosophy of science community and the people who were attacking the attempts to put intelligent design and creation science into the public school curriculum was that, no, it isn't. That these are pseudosciences, they're really religion, and they don't really qualify as science. And the general argument was that science, by its nature, in its essence, has to be naturalistic. And in particular, it must exclude any supernaturalistic explanations of events in the world. And this was accepted as correct by the judge in the case against the Dover Area School District following the testimony of expert witnesses against the teaching of intelligent design in the schools. Once God appears, even implicitly, it's religion. And this is part of his decision, which goes to something like 140 pages. The rigorous attachment to natural explanations is an essential attribute to science by definition and by convention. It is noticeable that defense experts, that's to say the defenders of intelligent design, own mission is to change the ground rules of science to allow supernatural causation of the natural world, which the Supreme Court in Edwards and the court in McLean correctly recognized as an inherently religious concept. Now, this strikes me as a very, well, first of all, it's very interesting that a court would be making a decision of a philosophical question, what it is that counts as the essence of science. But it also strikes me as a very ahistorical point of view. In the period of the scientific revolution, God was a central part of the picture for many of the participants. And that's what I would like to talk about this evening. I'd like to look at some of the history and look at some of the role that God played in the science of the period of the scientific revolution among some of the central players. And I'm going to try to show how God played quite an important, in fact, a central role in the enterprise. Then, after we've done a little bit of history, I want to return to this question and ask what this history does or doesn't tell us about the nature of science and about what we should be thinking about disputes like this. I'm assuming that you all have roughly an idea of what it is that the scientific revolution was. This is a period that's usually taken to begin with Copernicus in 1543, and the publication of his De Revolutionibus, in which he argues for the centrality of the sun rather than the earth, and goes up sometime through the middle or the end of the 18th century. And is basically the prelude to modern science as we know it. It includes figures such as Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, Leibniz, and many, many others. But let me begin with some words about two of these figures who, as we'll see, will go kind of closely together. That's to say Robert Boyle and Sir Isaac Newton. Boyle is, of course, best known today for Boyle's law, an equation that relates pressure, volume, and temperature in gases. But associating him with this alone underestimates, I think, his true importance for the history of science. So let me begin with just a few words about why it is that Boyle is really quite important. He's not a marginal character. It's really one of the central characters of the period. He was born in 1627, a few years before the condemnation of Galileo, died in 1690, a couple of years after the publication of Newton's famous mathematical principles of natural philosophy. Boyle was one of the most influential scientists of his day, one of the founders of the Royal Society, which was the first modern scientific institution in 1666, and an important figure in the birth of a seriously experimental science. The work that led to Boyle's law was connected with some experiments that he did with his famous air pump, a vacuum chamber in which he could experiment with the effects of vacuum on various things. This is the work in which, these are not directly relevant to my theme, but I love these pictures. This is the work in which he actually presents some of the results of his experiments with what he calls a new pneumatical engine. That's his air pump. And this is the diagram he gives in that work of the actual air pump. Rather unwieldy thing. If you see the thing at the bottom there, you actually pump the air out. There was a valve there that enabled you to pump the air out and actually produce a vacuum in the globe on top, the glass globe on top, in which you could actually perform experiments. And put things in and see what it is that happened when you actually put them in. And this is part of the frontispiece from an 18th century edition of Boyle's writings, an important 18th century edition of Boyle's writings. Now, if you notice, the vacuum pump is up there on the right, and if you look, you can see a bird flying around inside. It didn't fly around very long. This was a major discovery, though. Once you pump the air out, the bird dies. Then he tried it on a mouse and various other things like that. And this is how science advances, of course, through experiment, trying things. He was also, quite centrally important for the history of chemistry, sometimes called the father of modern chemistry. He was also a very important theoretician. His theoretical experimental treatise, called The Origin of Forms and Qualities, formulated in a concise and influential way what he called the corpuscular philosophy. Philosophy, by the way, at that time, was pretty much synonymous with science. It was broader, but it was any sort of systematic discipline. When these guys talk about philosophy as the corpuscular philosophy, they're not talking about philosophy like we do it in our philosophy department here. They're talking about science. And the corpuscular, or as he calls it inside the book, the mechanical philosophy, is the idea that everything in nature can be explained in terms of the size, shape, and motion of the smaller parts of everyday bodies as they collide with one another. And this is really, in a certain way, the beginning of modern theoretical science, as we now understand it, the explanation of the manifest, the observable properties of bodies in terms of the structure of parts of which it's made. And this was a fundamental treatise arguing experimentally as well as theoretically for that point. But it's interesting here that Boyle was also a very serious theologian. His theological writings, or his theological interests, appear throughout all of his writings. But they are brought together in one of his final works, something that is called the Christian Virtuoso. Virtuoso, by the way, is another word that doesn't mean now what it meant then. A virtuoso was an experimental philosopher. Virtuoso was what it is that these guys called themselves, who hung around in laboratories and tried things out and did experimental scientific work. The general theme is that science is good for religion, that doing experimental science is good for faith. What one learns from the study of nature leads us toward God and religion, and more than that, that the qualities that make one a good experimentalist, things like patience, willingness to learn new things and overturn old prejudices. That word, by the way, that he uses in his treatise is docility, which doesn't mean for him what it is that it means for us, of course. It means willingness to learn. That these are these qualities that make for a good virtuoso, that's to say a good experimental scientist, also make for a good Christian. In addition, I suspect that Boyle would also say that faith is good for experimental science. That is, the qualities that make one a good Christian should also make one a good experimental scientist as well. But that isn't argued in this book. It's just the opposite, the other case. That being a good scientist leads one to being a good Christian as well. And very prominent among the arguments is the claim that experimental science reveals things about the world that lead us directly to God. And let me give you just two instances of this from the Christian virtuoso. And indeed, the experimental philosophy giving us a more clear discovery than strangers to it have of the divine excellencies displayed in the fabric and conduct of the universe and of the creatures it consists of, very much indisposes the mind to ascribe such admirable effects to so incompetent and pitiful a cause as blind chance, or to the tumultuous justlings of atomical portions of senseless matter, and leads it directly to the acknowledgement and adoration of a most intelligent, powerful, and benign author of things, to whom alone such excellent productions may, with the greatest congruity, be ascribed. Right? And this is one way in which the study of nature that goes on in the laboratory leads us to God. And this is another passage in which he says much the same thing. This is at the bottom of the first column here. The first advantage that our experimental philosopher as such has toward being a Christian is that his course of studies conduces much to settle in his mind a firm belief of the existence and a diverse of the chief attributes of God, which belief is, in the order of things, the first principle of that natural religion which it felt is pre-required to revealed religion in general, and consequently to that in particular, which is embraced by Christians. That the consideration of the vastness, beauty, and regular motions of the heavenly bodies, the excellent structure of animals and plants, besides a multiple of other phenomena of nature, and the subserviency of most of those to man, may justly induce him, as a rational creature, to conclude that this vast, beautiful, orderly, and in a word, many ways admirable system of things that we call the world was framed by an author supremely powerful, wise, and good, and so on and so forth. And this is exactly the kind of inference that one finds in, say, intelligent design theory. And this is, of course, Boyle is not the first person to invent it either. This is an argument that you can trace back to the ancient philosophers as well, that the beauty, orderliness, complexity of the world, the harmony of the world leads us directly to God. And Boyle goes on and on and on about this. He clearly thinks, like the modern advocates of intelligent design, that from the beauty and order of the world one can infer to a divine creator who created and ordered things in the world. And this is an important observation. Not only does he think that this is not inconsistent with science as he understands it, he thinks that religion and science are deeply intertwined. Science leads one directly to religion, and the qualities that make one a good Christian also make one a good experimental philosopher. It's not surprising then on his death that Boyle gave a bequest to found a series of lectures in his memory, the Boyle Lectures, quote, for the defense of the Christian religion against atheists and other unbelievers. The first lecture was given in 1692, the year after Boyle's death, by Robert Bentley, a protege of Newton's, who Newton and Boyle, of course, were well known to one another and were friends. Bentley was a protege of Newton's, and these lectures, the first Boyle lectures, expressed many of Newton's views on religion and science. Bentley had corresponded with Newton to make sure that he was getting it right. This was a Principia Newton's Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy is dated on the title page 1687. It was actually published in, I think, November or December 1686. So it had been out. It was sort of the important scientific book that everybody was talking about. And Bentley used this as sort of the text for his sermons in the Boyle lectures. And at this point, I'd like to turn to Newton to talk about his views on God and the physical world. Now, Newton doesn't need the introduction that Boyle does. He's, of course, the author of the monumental Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, a book that, in a certain way, ends an important stage of the scientific revolution and begins what we would call modern physics. And this is where it is that he presents the three laws of motion and derives his theory of universal gravitation. And this is the title page of the first edition that was in Latin. But Newton, of course, was much more than just the Principia. He was also very important for the history of mathematics, one of the inventors of the calculus. We'll get to Leibniz later, who was the other inventor of the calculus. He's important for his optics, for his alchemy. Over the last 20 or 30 years, historians of science have been more and more interested in his alchemical papers, which probably outnumber his papers in physics and mathematics by a considerable margin. He was also president of the Royal Society for many years, exchequer of the Treasury and so on, of the Mint and so on and so forth. But there's another side to Newton as well. Newton was something of a theologian, not altogether an orthodox theologian. His own views tended toward Unitarianism, which is ironic since he was a professor at Trinity College, Cambridge. And needless to say, that was not a popular view there, or for that matter, many other places in England. It was something that he had to keep pretty quiet, although we now have his theological papers, and it's pretty clear that that was his view. But he was also interested in biblical interpretation as well as biblical chronology, that's to say, which is an interesting combination of, on the one hand, biblical scholarship, on the other hand, astronomy, observational astronomy, because astronomical events are what it is that you can use to actually reliably date particular events. But his interest in God and religion and theology permeates his scientific thought very much in the way in which it does Boyle's. Here is a letter to Bentley, who was the first Boyle lecturer, in which Bentley had asked him some questions about what it is that we can learn from the Principia about God and theology, and he wrote back, "The motions which the planets now have could not spring from any natural cause alone, but were impressed by an intelligent agent. For since comets descend into the region of our planets, and here move all manner of ways, going sometimes the same way with planets, sometimes the contrary way, and sometimes in crossways, in planes inclined to the plane of the ecliptic, and at all kinds of angles, it is plain that there is no natural cause which could determine all the planets, both primary and secondary, to move the same way in the same plane without considerable variation. This must have been the effect of counsel. Nor is there any natural cause which could give the planets those just degrees of velocity which were requisite to make them move in such concentric orbs about those bodies. To make this system, therefore, with all its motions, required a cause which understood and compared together the quantities of matter in the several bodies, and to compare and adjust all these things together in so great a variety of bodies, argues that cause to be not blind and fortuitous, but very well skilled in mechanics and geometry." God, obviously, God the mechanic and geometrist. This was something that was unpublished in Newton's day, but of course it was published not that long after. Letters in those days were of two sorts. There were the personal letters. Why don't you come over for dinner? We're having so-and-so else over, and so on and so forth. But then there were many letters that were written with the intention that they would eventually find their way into print. And I'm sure that this is exactly the kind of thing that Newton had in mind here. We'll see another instance of that later. This, though, is something that he printed in the second edition of the Principia, his main scientific work of physics. This is from the General Scholium, famous General Scholium, at the very end of Book 3 of the Principia, where he writes, "This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And if the fixed stars are the centers of other like systems, these being formed by the likewise counsel, must be all subject to the dominion of one." Especially, that means that you don't have a separate intelligent and powerful being for each planetary system. Especially since the light of the fixed stars is of the same nature with the light of the sun, and from every system, light passes to all the other systems, unless the systems of the fixed stars should by their gravity fall on each other. He has placed those systems at immense distances from one another. This being governs all things, not as the soul of the world, but as the Lord over all. And on account of his dominion, he is wont to be called Lord God, Pantocrator, or universal ruler. And finally, this is a slide from the Optics. And this is a little harder to read, but it's very, very, very interesting. You'll see I'm going to read from the last two sentences on page 377. This is what he did, was he wrote the Book of Optics, and then in the second, and again in the third edition, added queries in which he brought up things that are sort of speculations and ideas that were not yet fully formed and ready to be put into a real scientific treatise, but which he thought were sort of interesting. And this is where this comes from. It says, "Now by the help of these principles, all material things seem to be composed of the hard and solid particles above mentioned," which he talks about. This is where also in this particular query, there's a lot of his alchemical stuff above mentioned, variously associated in the first creation by the counsel of an intelligent agent. For it became him who created them to set them in order. And if he did so, it's unphilosophical to seek for any other origin of the world, or to pretend that it might arise out of a chaos by the mere laws of nature. Though, being once formed, it may continue by those laws for many ages, and so on. And this is pretty much the same sentiment that we saw in the other two, but what's really interesting here is what he says, and if he did so, it's unphilosophical to seek any other origin of the world. Remember what philosophy means in this period. What he's saying is it's unscientific. Not merely it's consistent with science, but that it would be unscientific for us to look for any other explanation if this is the appropriate one. And I think that that's very, very striking. So far, we've been dealing with two important scientific thinkers who were sympathetic to the idea that the order of the world requires a divine agent, an intelligent designer. But in neither case does the theology enter into the details of their science. In both cases, it is sort of a reflection on their science. We look at their science and we say, or they look at their science and they look at the world that they've discovered and say, well, the order and beauty and harmony testifies to the existence of divine designer. But the actual science, one might argue here, is independent of theology. I'd like to turn now to two other important thinkers for whom the theology actually enters into the details of their science, and that is Descartes and Leibniz, who we think of now as philosophers, perhaps in part because of that, but who among their contemporaries were important scientific thinkers. Descartes is today known as the philosopher who said cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I exist, the author of the Meditations. And his Meditations continue to be read in introductory philosophy classes all over the world, including at Princeton. But Descartes was a very important scientist as well. That part of his intellectual personality has been somewhat eclipsed by his more narrowly philosophical interest, philosophical now in our sense. He was the inventor of analytic geometry, and Cartesian coordinates are named for him. He was the first who thought of nature as governed by laws. He was the first person to use the word law in anything other than either the normal political sense where a prince or a legislature forms a law or where God is a law. But to talk about the laws of nature, Descartes is the first to use that term, and I think also to think of this as what it is that's going on. And he's among the first to publish what we now think of as the law of inertia, that a body in uniform rectilinear motion will remain in uniform rectilinear motion unless otherwise interfered with. He is responsible for the first publication of the law of refraction in optics, and probably an independent discoverer. This is what's known in Anglo-Saxon histories of science as Snell's law, though I think the French have a different way of thinking of it. He also, his mechanistic ideas about human physiology, the idea of the human being as a complicated machine, were also extremely influential on the development of the life sciences after his death. And altogether, I think Descartes, together with his rough contemporary Galileo, was one of the most important of the physicists before Newton. But for Descartes, the entire framework of his physics, which is to say the laws of nature, which ground everything, are grounded directly in God, in God's activity in the world. These are Descartes' laws of nature, the principles of philosophy of 1644. There are three laws and then a sort of general law that governs them all. The general law is that the total quantity of motion, size times speed, remains constant in the universe. He was close. It turns out that it's size times velocity, not size times speed. He didn't think directionality was involved in there, but still a pretty good first step. That remains constant in the universe. Law 1, each and everything, insofar as it can, always continues in the same state, and thus what is once in motion always continues to move. The standard view was that bodies in motion tend to come to rest. And this, of course, is in contradiction with that, and in contradiction with most of our everyday experience as well. Law 2, all motion is in itself rectilinear, and hence any body moving in a circle always tends to move away from the center of the circle which it describes. Laws 1 and 2 together are what we think of as the law of inertia, as articulated by Newton in his Principia, later in the century, about 50 years later. If a body collides with 40 years later, If a body, law 3, if a body collides with another body that's stronger than itself, it loses none of its motion. But if it collides with a weaker body, it loses a quantity of motion equal to that which it imparts to the other body. This one turned out to be a disaster. And it was the first one to be corrected, but nevertheless, this is the first attempt to articulate the laws of nature that govern all bodies and their interactions with one another. And it's pretty impressive in that respect. But what's especially interesting, though, is the way in which God is central to the establishment of these laws. And here I'm reading from the justification of the conservation law, but the justification of the other laws are parallel. Now, as far as the general cause is concerned, the general cause of motion, it seems clear to me that this is no other than God himself. In the beginning, in his omnipotence, he created matter along with its motion and rest. And now, merely by his regular concurrence, he preserves the same amount of motion and rest in the material universe as he put there in the beginning. For, now here's the justification, for we understand that God's perfection involves not only his being immutable in himself, but also operating in a manner that is always utterly constant and immutable. Now there are some changes whose occurrence is guaranteed either by our own plain experience, I think what he has in mind there is mind-body interaction, or by divine revelation, and I think he has in mind there miracles. And either our perception or our faith shows us that these take place without any change in the Creator. But apart from these, we should not suppose that any other changes occur in God's work, in case this suggests some inconstancy in God. Thus, God imparted various motions to the parts of matter when he first created them, and he now preserves all this matter in the same way, and by the same process by which he originally created it. And it follows from what we have said that this fact alone makes it most reasonable to think that God likewise always preserves the same quantity of motion and matter. The strategy here is really interesting. What he's arguing for is something that goes counter to experience. In our ordinary experience, bodies in motion tend to come to rest, and it looks as if motion is being lost constantly in the world. But what he's arguing is from God and the way in which he acts on the world, that that's not the case. The strategy is to imagine God conserving from moment to moment bodies in existence. Bodies in existence would pass out of existence without God's constant conservation. This, by the way, is a theological doctrine that goes back quite far. You can find it certainly in St. Thomas in the 13th century. But Descartes says, and this is the sort of brilliant thing, God acts immutably, and therefore, once he puts a certain amount of motion in the world, he preserves that from moment to moment. And he uses similar arguments to establish the other laws. And this, it's interesting, is not just an inference from the orderly creation to a divine design and a divine designer, as we found in Boyle and Newton. This is using God to establish the details of your science. The actual content of the laws of nature is grounded in a certain conception of God and the way in which God acts on the world. This is, I think, importantly different from what it is that we saw in Boyle and Newton. And let me look now at the last of the four characters that I'd like to be talking about, and that's Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz. Leibniz was not as well known, is not as well known as Newton as a scientist. If he's known at all outside of philosophical circles, where he still is, as Descartes is, he's known for his dispute with Newton over the invention of the calculus. And I can assure you that they both invented it, though quite independently. That Newton didn't, that Leibniz actually didn't steal it from Newton. That's the general consensus. But in his day, which was just about the same as Newton's day, they were pretty close contemporaries, he was as well known and as important as Newton was. He was known as a mathematician, Newton invented the calculus but didn't tell anybody about it. Leibniz, who I think was probably more interested in fame than Newton was, broadcast it all around. He realized, I think Newton didn't quite realize what it is that he had. Leibniz realized that this was a major new branch of mathematics, and he broadcast it everywhere, developed it, and publicized it, and lobbied for professors in important universities to be in his mathematical camp. He was also important as a physicist, though not as important as Newton was. It's interesting, when the Principia came out, it was immediately translated into the Leibnizian calculus, and people could understand it because Leibniz's calculus was much easier to use. Leibniz invented the elongated S notation, you know, the dx, dy notation that we use now in the calculus. People found that much easier. So they translated Newtonian physics into Leibnizian mathematics. He was a metaphysician, he was a linguist, he was a political thinker. In fact, that's how it is that he earned his living. He was counselor to the House of Hanover, the Elector of Hanover, who later became George I of England. He was a jurisprudent, he was a historian, he was also a poet. And he did everything. But he was also a theologian, like all the rest. His theodicy of 1710 was one of the very important documents in philosophical theology, in which he attempted to reconcile or explain the ways of God to us human beings, and why it is that there's evil in the world. As with the other figures that we've been examining, Leibniz from the beginning saw his science and his theology as intimately united. Here's something that he wrote when he was 23 years old. His first works, by the way, that we have were written when he was 17 years old. So he's already a seasoned philosopher, I guess, at this moment. Through the admirable improvement of mathematics and the approaches which chemistry and anatomy have opened into the nature of things, it has become apparent that mechanical explanations, reasons from the figure and motion of bodies, as it were, can be given for most of the things which the ancients referred only to the Creator, or to some kind of known out what of incorporeal forms. He's talking about Boyle's program from The Origin of Forms and Qualities, 1666, 3 years earlier. The result was that truly capable men for the first time began to try to save or to explain natural phenomena, or those which appear in bodies without assuming God, or taking him into their reasoning. Then, after their attempt had met with some little success, though before they arrived at foundations and principles, they proclaimed, as if rejoicing prematurely at their security, that they could find neither God nor the immortality of the soul by natural reason, but that in these matters faith must rest either on civil laws, that's to say, established, politically established religion, or on historical records, that's to say, the Bible. And of course, he goes on in this particular essay to argue that if we understand mechanical philosophy correctly, we'll be led to God. Somewhat different way than in Boyle's argument, but nevertheless, it's that kind of thing. And throughout his career, Leibniz saw God in the whole physical world, and his physics is very much infused with this spirit, as was Newton's, as was Boyle's, as was Descartes'. But most interesting is the way in which God comes up at the end of his life in a dispute with the Anglican divine Samuel Clarke. There was a correspondence in the last 2 years of Leibniz's life with Samuel Clarke. An interesting and sort of sad story. The whole court from Hanover went over to England, leaving Leibniz behind. And his boss, George, Elector of Hanover, didn't want to take him, in part because he was angry with him because Leibniz was supposed to finish a history of the House of Hanover, but he was so busy with other projects that he never got around to it. And second of all, because there was tremendous feeling against Leibniz and against the Germans in England at that point, stirred up by Newton and the controversy of the calculus. And George himself felt that it would be impolitic to add Leibniz to the mix of his German court. So he left him in Hanover. But Leibniz entered into a correspondence then with the English scientist. He wanted to enter into a correspondence with Newton. Newton imperiously refused to enter into a correspondence with Leibniz, but he sort of designated Clark and actually wrote pieces of the letters that Clark replied, and was obviously, Clark was just a mouthpiece for Newton. So this is as close as we've got to a real confrontation between Newton and Leibniz. But in any case, the issue, there are a bunch of issues here, and it's a wonderful correspondence, but the one I want to touch on just briefly concerns space and time. And the terrain of the argument is the nature of God. Well, let me begin with, this is Newton's account of space. Newton, this is the beginning of the Principia, the scholium following the definitions in the beginning. He makes a distinction between absolute time, relative time, absolute space, absolute motion, relative motion. And this is his definition of absolute space. Absolute space of its own nature, without reference to anything external, always remains homogeneous and immovable. Relative space is any movable measure or dimension of this absolute space. Newton thought that it was important, given that space, time, motion are important parameters in his physics, to say something about what they were. And he thought that it was necessary for the foundations of his physics to posit that there is such a thing as absolute space. And that this is what it is that we're talking about: absolute space, absolute time, absolute motion. Not just the measures that we have. Leibniz, on the other hand, offers a different conception of what it is that space is. And this is from the letters with Clark. Lots of other places too, but this is a handy place for them. These letters, by the way, Leibniz died without answering Clark's last letter. Clark published them the next year, both his and Leibniz's. So these were public documents. I hold space to be something merely relative, as time is, that I hold it to be an order of coexistences, as time is an order of successions. For space denotes, in terms of possibility, an order of things which exist at the same time, considered as existing together, without entering into their particular manners of existence. And when many things are seen together, one perceives this order of things among themselves. Slightly complicated, but the basic point is, all there really are in the world are bodies. There is no such thing as space. Space is an abstract way of talking about the relations between bodies. Their orders with respect to one another. So space is not a something, it's just a kind of grid that we can impose on a world of bodies. But there's nothing to the world except the bodies themselves and their relations with one another. And we don't need anything more than that to do physically. Now, how can the nature of God decide between these two theories of space? Well, here is what Leibniz says about God. He says lots of things about God, but this is the relevant one in the context of the letters of Clark. The great foundation of mathematics is the principle of contradiction or identity, that is, that a proposition cannot be true and false at the same time. But in order to proceed from mathematics to natural philosophy, that's to say physics, another principle is required, as I've observed in my theodicy. I mean the principle of sufficient reason, namely that nothing happens without a reason why it should be so rather than otherwise. Now, by that single principle, namely that there ought to be a sufficient reason why things should be so and not otherwise, one may demonstrate the being of God and all the other parts of metaphysics or natural theology, and even in some measure those principles of natural philosophy that are independent of mathematics. I mean the dynamic principles or the principles of force. Leibniz's idea is that God has got to have some reason for choosing the things that he chooses, and we can use our insight into God's ability to reason, or the kinds of reasons that are out there and available, to choose things like the appropriate conservation law. There has to be conservation law. His favorite conservation law is conservation of the ability to do work. And it's, why would God allow work, either the ability to do work to be lost without any reason, or to be gained without any reason? Therefore, it must remain constant. God doesn't choose arbitrarily. Or if it's lost, you lose 5% or 10% or 12.378%. There's no particular reason to choose any one of those. So you choose the conservation law that says the exact amount of ability to do work is conserved from one state to another. God always acts with a reason. And here is Clark. That's to say, Newton's response. The mathematical principles of philosophy, Newton's of course, show that the state of things could not arise from anything but an intelligent and free cause. It's important, intelligent and free cause. 'Tis very true that nothing is without a sufficient reason why it is, and why it is thus rather than otherwise. And therefore, where there is no cause, there can be no effect. But this sufficient reason is oftentimes no other than the mere will of God. I just wanted to do it that way. That's all God needs to say to satisfy Newton/Clark. For instance, why this particular system of matter should be created in one particular place and not in another particular place, when all place being absolutely indifferent to all matter, it would have been exactly the same thing, vice versa, supposing the two systems or particles of matter to be alike. There can be no other reason but the mere will of God, which if it could in no case act without a predetermined cause, any more than a balance can move without a preponderating weight. This would tend to take away all power of choosing and introduce fatality. So Clark wants God to be absolutely free. For God to be bound by a reason would mean that God that God is like a balance, who is forced to go one way or another. Clark's God is free and do whatever he likes. And this is Leibniz's reply, and this is sort of long and sort of late, but this is really such a good argument, such an interesting argument at all. Read it. I say then that if space were an absolute being, that's Newton's view, something would happen for which it would be impossible that there should be a sufficient reason, which is against my axiom, and I can prove it thus. Space is something absolutely uniform, and without the things placed in it, one point of space absolutely does not differ in anything from another point of space. Now, from hence it follows, supposing space to be something in itself, that it is impossible there should be a reason why God, preserving the same situations of bodies among themselves, should have placed them in space after one certain particular manner and not otherwise. Why everything was not placed in quite the contrary way, for instance, by changing east into west. But if space is nothing else but this ordered relation, and is nothing at all without bodies but the possibility of placing them, then those two states, the one such as it is now, and the other supposed to be quite the contrary way, would not at all differ from one another. Their difference, therefore, is only to be found in our chimerical supposition of the reality of space itself. But in truth, the one would be exactly the same thing as the other, they being absolutely indiscernible. And consequently, there is no room to inquire after a reason for the preference of the one for the other. And here, I think theology has real consequences for your conception of the physical world. If you think about God as governed by reasons, then you cannot adopt Newton's absolute space, because that would force God to make a choice for which there is no possible reason. Shall we do it left to right or right to left? Shall we recreate the entire world 5 inches to the left or 5 inches to the right? None of it could there possibly be a reason for God to choose one over the other. But for Leibniz, all of those are just simply different ways of describing the same situation, since space is just the relations among existing bodies. So if you think that God is governed by reason, then there can't be absolute space. But if you think that God is absolutely free to do whatever it is that he wants, then an absolute conception of space is coherent. And again, theology and science are deeply intertwined. The debate between Leibniz and Newton over the nature of space is equally well a debate over the nature of God. And this is exactly how they saw it. The debate, we now often pick out the sort of scientific parts of this dispute, but they saw it as primarily a theological dispute. And that's the way it's framed from the beginning. Okay, now with this, the history part is over. And got to return to the 21st century. My conclusion is that if we look at the history of science, there isn't the radical distinction between science and theology that we now take for granted. And I'll put this slide back up. If Boyle and Newton, Descartes and Leibniz were scientists, then it would seem okay to mix science and religion, contrary to what Judge Jones said so confidently. So I think if there's something wrong with creation science and intelligent design, it isn't because it fails some arbitrary definition of what counts as science and what doesn't. But what conclusions can we draw from this? Should we return to their time, which is, say, the 17th century, the scientific revolution, mix science and theology, the natural and the supernatural, as the adherents of creation science or intelligent design propose? Well, one possible conclusion would go something like this. Look, the distinction between them and us, between these earlier guys and us, is just sociological. They accept God, we accept reason and experiment. But had we been alive at that time, we would have accepted God and agreed with them about science and scientific explanation. And one might argue here, well, there's no real truth of the matter. It's all a matter of what culture you happen to grow up in. Reason for us, theology for them, it's all the same. So you might as well accept what it is that the intelligent design people have proposed. How can we distinguish between them, that's to say the 17th century guys and their theological physics and us? Why should we? But here's another way of seeing the matter. Obviously, I'm not going to rest with that. I think that that's not a very satisfying way of going. Well, science is a human institution. I think it doesn't have an eternal and unchangeable essence. And I think that the attempt to say this is true by definition is inherently unsatisfying. It's an institution, a human institution. We make of it what we want to make of it. And we have changed since the 17th century to the 21st century. And it's clear that we have made of science something naturalistic and something distinct from theology. Why? What differentiates us from them? Well, we have one tool that they don't, and that is Darwin. And I'm not now talking about the truth of, or the scientific respectability of Darwinian biology. But what Darwin has given us is the idea that out of chaos, order can emerge through the laws of nature alone. And this is certainly something that's transformed biology, but it's transformed, I think, the way in which we look at the world. we have learned something that these guys, smart as they were, I'm thinking of Boyle and Newton and Leibniz and Descartes, just simply didn't know. That in the face of order, the only explanation that they had available was God, the intelligent designer. We have another explanation. We can conceive of a mechanism that they couldn't, a way for order to emerge out of chaos in a thoroughly naturalistic way. And because of this, the inference that was valid for them, an inference from order to a divine intelligence producing that order, is no longer valid for us. And this is, I think, a very interesting thing. When these guys in the 17th century made that inference, it was a valid inference, given what they knew and given what they believed. It was a valid inference. It is no longer valid for us because what we have thought up since then. I won't say learned, because I won't, I do think Darwinian biology is true, but that's not really the issue. The issue is that we have thought of mechanisms now that enable us to explain order in naturalistic ways that they couldn't have known about at that point, or that they didn't know about at that point. Now, it's very interesting to go back and see what the world looked like to our intellectual ancestors in the period of the scientific revolution, and see how the world looked when everything was infused with a divine glow, as it was for all of these people. But with what we have learned in the meantime, we can't go home again. This is not to say that we have to reject God or theology, but I think that we can no longer read God off in nature the way a Boyle or Newton or Descartes or Leibniz would. Thank you for your patience. No objections? Yes. Oh, absolutely. The argument, I mean, you can follow the argument.
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was, do I think that current intelligent design people are using but the same vocabulary, the same argument? Well, the argument, it's basically the argument for design. That's called the argument for design for the existence of God. And it goes back, I think it goes back certainly to Cicero in the De Natura Deorum, on the nature of the gods. And, can be found after that, quite frequently. It's one of St. Thomas's 5 ways, and so on and so forth. And I'm not sure that they're specifically getting it from Newton or from Boyle. And of course, you find it all through the 18th century. It is refuted by David Hume in his dialogues concerning natural religion in a series of arguments that are considered by philosophers at least to be sort of the definitive refutation, but nobody seems to have paid attention to it. Until you get to, which is interesting, until you get to Darwin. And at that point, once you have the mechanism of, that I think is the real genius, people have thought of, I mean, again, since the ancients, you can find in Lucretius and Epicurus, more clearly in Lucretius and De Rerum Natura, the nature of things, an argument, an evolutionary argument that says it all started in the beginning and then things just sort of evolved to the present state, in a purely naturalistic way. That didn't have any influence because people would say, that's purely arbitrary. How could such a thing happen? And it wasn't until Darwin, I think, that the final nail in the coffin of the argument for design was driven. But then it seems to me that the people doing intelligent design are rewinding exactly that argument. But it's not a very good argument anymore, though it obviously has an excellent historical take.
How much do you think these people's writings were either influenced or not influenced, but were forced or had to adhere to the church because of all of its power? How much do you think the church's role was in what they wrote?
For these people, not at all. I think people really believe a lot of this stuff. And you could certainly point to people who hid their views because of that. Hobbes, I think, was a genuine atheist. Spinoza, I think, may well have been a genuine atheist. He certainly was a genuine heretic. And for that reason, I mean, Spinoza's ring, his seal, says "Caute," be careful, cautious. And so obviously there were people who did alter their views to fit orthodoxy. Well, I think these guys know. I think they really believe what it is that they were arguing. Yes?
Well, I'd like to follow on the question that was just posed because I was thinking along the same lines. And isn't one of the issues really the extent to which one lives in a political society where theology or whatever is the dominant religious belief system limits and guides what it is that scientists can do, what questions they can explore, and what experiments they can engage in, versus the notion that science is inherently skeptical and you follow your line of inquiry through experimentation to wherever it leads you, even if the conclusion flies in the face of accepted belief systems in your society. It seems to me that that's what the political debate is about who's going to control what's taught in the schools today. And it relates back to what's permissible in a theocratic state when scientists are pushing the envelope about how you perceive the world. Would you agree?
Yeah. It's an interesting, it's a very, very complicated question. I don't think that it's easy to make these kinds of generalizations. When you're looking at these individuals, you know, it's not as if, you know, somebody is 100% a scientist and somebody else is 100% a theologian at that point. I suppose that there are cases like that. But the typical case is, you know, these four guys that I was talking about, and there are a whole bunch of others that could have been talked about. For example, Kepler, whose doctorate was in theology. So of course he's now known as, you know, for his work in astronomy. But these are complicated people who have commitments on both sides, and of course there are institutions that are involved. And the obvious in this period incident that I didn't mention was the condemnation of Galileo, which happened in 1633, 11 years before Descartes, 1632, 12 years before Descartes published his Principles of Philosophy, and did have a chilling effect on science in Italy for the rest of the century. On the other hand, when you look at the Italian situation, at that point, you know, people blame the Jesuits for all sorts of things. They were actually among the scientifically most progressive. They were originally supporters of Galileo, and openly so. There's a certain amount of, you know, we think of it as religion versus science. What it really was to a certain extent politics, and trouble Galileo got himself into by deeply offending people who he shouldn't have offended, and by, like the Pope, for example. But it was very much a personal thing. You know, overstepping, you know, his arrogance and overstepping the boundaries, as well as the very peculiar religious politics. What Galileo was proposing in a way is, let me tell you how to interpret the Bible. remember Protestantism. And there was a debate in 16th century and councils that involved, judgments about who has the right to say what the Bible says. And Galileo, not being sophisticated theologically, sort of jumps right into the middle of it. Which is to say that I think when you look at any religion versus science conflict, what you see underneath is that it's really a lot more complicated. Whose religion, whose science? There are different conceptions of what religion is. Somebody who's a biblical literalist is going to react very differently than somebody who takes a more liberal interpretation of the Bible. There are scientists then as today who are perfectly happy to reconcile what they're doing with various forms of theology, and there are others who are militantly atheists, like most recently Richard Dawkins. It's hard, I think, to generalize. There are going to be disputes. People are contentious. There are going to be disputes between people who identify themselves with religion and others who identify themselves with science. But if you look in science, there are disputes there. If you look in theology, goodness knows, there are the wars of religion, right, between the Protestants and the Catholics in 16th and 17th century. And I think to focus narrowly on the dispute between science and religion is, I think, to distort. I don't think that there's anything, the way in which I express sort of my view about the relation between science and religion is there's no inherent or essential conflict. Because strictly speaking, there's no such thing as religion, and there's no such thing as science. There are a whole lot of various things. This gets to the point about there's no such thing as being essentially scientific. There's no such thing as being essentially theological either. Yes?
Just going back to this argument here about the judge. Your main problem is the word definition.
In essence.
Because if you were to say in its current state, science is such that
Right.
natural explanation is important,
Right.
then it becomes science.
It would be okay, but it would be weaker. Because then for somebody to say, well, in its current state it's this, but, why can't we change it? There's nothing, you can still be doing science and just simply say, look, remember what Newton said, that, it would be unphilosophical, that's to say unscientific, to deny that there is an intelligent creator and that the world just simply came out of chance. This is just sort of a thought experiment. Suppose we really do live in a world which was created by an intelligent designer, either life or the whole thing, as you like. Wouldn't you want physicists or biologists or whatever who are inquiring into the origin of these things to discover that? Wouldn't that be, as scientific a discovery as anything else, if, as a matter of fact, that really was the true explanation? And this is what you see. I mean, this kind of a priori limitation sort of prevents, in a certain way, prevents science from going where it is that it may have to go at some point. Though I don't think it's going to go there. Personally, yes.
Did science really ever go there? I mean,
Go where?
isn't to finding a God? Because doesn't science really assume metaphysically that we can understand the natural world and interpret it, that it's intelligent to us?
Yeah.
Once you say that, well, it's just God's will, that's it. It's the end of the game. We have nothing to say anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, but the thing is, I mean, it's a methodological assumption as opposed to I think a substantive assumption.
Well, it is. I think it is substantive. You can't understand the natural world. If it isn't intelligible to man's brain, which one could argue it's not, then what good is science? There is no science.
Well, but the thing is, if we we, in a certain sense, this is the methodological assumption that we make when we investigate nature in this way, is that we will find naturalistic explanations, and it is the faith, it's this sort of methodological program that keeps the project going. I mean, that's absolutely right. But I still, it certainly isn't impossible to imagine living in a world in which some aspect of it really does trace back to an intelligent designer. If you don't think, it's sort of the whole shebang, imagine ancient astronauts or something like that. Various, at some point we may discover that, I won't say we may discover, but it is not inconceivable. It's not impossible that something like that is true, in which case our methodological assumption may turn out to be unfounded. I don't think that's going to happen, but nevertheless it seems to me it's important to recognize that, to understand what it is exactly that we're doing.
Are you aware of any scientist who has changed his or her religious beliefs because of experimental results?
Personally, no, but I don't know. I mean, there are. The Templeton Foundation these days has been funding basically scientists who will speak out in favor of religion, you can find on their website, I'm sure, a number of sometimes fairly well-known and distinguished scientists who are willing to speak out in favor of religion. Now, did they change their views because of the scientific investigation? I can't tell you, but it certainly is not impossible. I just don't know. Yes?
What's your understanding of Einstein's view about the connection between God and science?
Well, I don't really know. I'm told that he was a Spinozist. But since I think that Spinoza was an atheist, that probably is not his understanding of Spinoza. I think that, Spinoza, I think, as Einstein understood him, identified God and nature. And so it was a very, that kind of a conception about that. I don't really know. Yes?
This question is somewhat off the topic, but I've been trying to ask it. Are you in any way related to Daniel Garber, the Impressionist painter?
I wish I were.